to Money Matters. I'm Emily Johnson, Certified Financial Planner and Managing Director of Polaris Capital Advisors, and I am joined, as always, by the wonderful and talented David Kroll of Mortgage Network. And we are here once again to discuss all things where your money and pocketbook and investments matter. So we wanted to kick off today just giving a little rundown of where the markets have been. It's been actually sort of interesting, getting a little bit more volatile, although not that volatile, not certainly relative to previous months and years, but what we're seeing a little bit more volatility after the State of the Union. We had a fantastic market day, then we had a little bit of a dip that actually ended as a dip the following day in bigger terms than we've actually been seeing over the past several weeks mostly. So it's sort of interesting to see that volatility spike up. We're kind of getting into the meat of some of the political agenda right now when it comes to Obamacare, taxes, or the so-called tax plan that should be coming out, the so-called Obamacare plan change that should be coming out, and some environmental aspects that might trigger a little bit more, not to mention, I suppose, the Russians, not to mention that, but that might trigger a little bit more volatility in the markets. That said, we've sort of been seeing that for the past few months, and volatility is really, really low. So we're sort of expecting this, sort of continued upward/sideways trend for a little bit with increased volatility until some of these things are actually out in the open, and then we'll see where they go. The other thing that's interesting is what's happening with interest rates, which is really more David's forte than mine. But we've been seeing those start to edge up, and it's sort of regardless of, at least the assumption is that that's regardless of what the Fed is expected to do, or maybe only slightly impacted by that. But why don't you jump in on that one?
It's there's a lot of ifs and whats and coulds and maybes, just as Emily said. To a large extent, the growth in the market is a speculative growth. It has not yet been underpinned by any actual growth. There does seem to be the beginnings, the glimmers of inflation running at about 2%.
Which is a good thing.
Which is a good thing. It's right at the range of control that the Fed, in the days when the Fed was meaningful, it was right in the target range for the Fed. That would imply, if it costs 3%, remember maybe you've been watching Money Matters for the last 3 or 4 years, and you faithfully have studied every single segment.
I know we do have people that tape it.
Yeah, there are people who actually tape it. But you remember that an interest rate is composed of a core rate, which is the amount of money that a bank or a lender such as Mortgage Network needs in order to run an operation, make a dollar, and conduct the business of banking. That's about 3%. If there's zero inflation, then the money goes to the street at 3%. If there's inflation of 2%, which is what it appears that the stable long-term rate, long as 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, the betting is that we're looking at about 2% inflation. That would imply 3% the core rate plus 2%. About 5%.
So you're saying that borrowing rate would be around 5%?
Around 5%. The Fed has been left kind of in the dust here. The markets have moved independent of Fed and independent of the Fed's news. It really became less of a factor when the Fed itself was used as the stimulator in the great stimulus of 2009, 10, 11, 12. Using the Fed in that capacity because
in the reverse, though, in quantitative easing and in thus lowering rates. So
That's
in
correct.
The reverse now as it's coming up there.
Right. They lowered rates. We, the country, used the Fed to help us to recover from the recession. That's in retrospect, maybe a misuse or an abuse of the Fed because it was substituting for a Congress which was inactive. Yeah. We won't get into politics as to exactly why it was inactive, but it was inactive. We needed something to get the economy going. We used the Fed as the joystick. The Fed gradually reduce rates to zero. At that point, there's no place to go. The Fed is not at zero today, but it's darn close too. So the Fed will not be relevant again until rates are higher, basically. Joblessness is at about 4.6%. This is the, without getting into an argument about the percentage of the workforce that is unemployed, which is a completely different phenomenon. Old people are unemployed, children who go to nursery school are unemployed. There's a whole bunch of people who are unemployed.
There's
about 45% of the population are technically unemployed.
And yet, I mean, I know you and I usually disagree on that calculation, but it does seem that those who are able to work, there are more of those individuals trying to enter the workforce now, which is a good thing, which is an optimistic thing. I mean, so that does skew the numbers somewhat, but at least it does appear that we're starting to see some of those who can work try to enter the workforce, and before they have been sitting on the sidelines with either the assumption that the jobs weren't there or because the jobs weren't there.
The workforce, and this is not a liberal or a conservative statement, this is this is ground level economics. The workforce is at near full employment based on the standards and tests that we've used for the last 60 years. Now, if you don't like the standards and tests we've used for the last 60 years, then we can substitute some new ones.
Well,
but
the point there is just what are
it's
the
at near
inputs?
full employment,
Yeah.
which means that we're, and we should explore this maybe in the second half, which means that at near full employment, when you then stimulate the economy, an economy that's going along at near its capacity, you run a very real risk of inflation. And you get into a new kind of vicious cycle. We've been in for a boring post-disaster economy for the last 6 or 7 years, which was low inflation, low growth, kind of are we in the final stage of capitalism where nothing much can happen? Low yields on investments. I mean, it does look that as if we may be entering a new period of growth and volatility.
Well, what's interesting so the hyperinflation argument has been around for the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, it really coming out of the recession, that was immediately, at least with the talking heads that we listen to and with a lot of the money managers that we work with, that was sort of the comment starting 4 years ago is we're going to get into a hyperinflationary market. You need to sell all of your bonds. We're going to get into, hyperinflation is going to come now. And it sure as heck hasn't. And so as you're watching the Fed become less and less effective or important in these decisions as the market has really driven rates back up again, if we do, and we will eventually, I mean, as we're seeing rates start to come up, as little as they might be coming up, and they're still historically so low, if we do get into that hyperinflationary environment, then the Fed will actually most likely become effective again. So we might have this period now of a 4 or 5 year lull, and perhaps that extends for another 2 years, depending on innumerable variables. But if we see that continue, and then eventually we will get into an inflationary, perhaps even hyperinflationary environment, that's where the Fed will really have to step in and start controlling, because that's really the Fed's job, is to control inflation and to control employment. Not control it, but they have targets for both. So if we did end up with a full employment and a hyper-inflationary environment, they would then have to step in. So they might be ineffective right now, but if and when we hit that point, because we will, it will happen. We'll start hearing more from Janet.
So we will have a very interesting conversation, and we'll try to keep it apolitical in the second half, because we're headed into a period where some of the big chess pieces are different than we've seen for the last 6 or 7 years. We have a president who is very likely to really stimulate the economy and to stimulate it using debt, using deficit, because you can't lower taxes and have a massive infrastructure program and alter the health system, which is an extraordinarily expensive health system. these things are going to be in conflict with one another in an economy that's almost at full efficiency. So it's going to be interesting.
It definitely is.
It's going to be interesting.
Well, we will dig into this a little bit more in the second half. Please stick with us for more Money Matters. We'll be right back.